Okay, so it is now 3 p.m. We are ready to start. So at this time, I'm going to introduce REL Northeast Islands researcher Carrie Parker. Carrie leads our Connecticut English Learner Research Partnership, and she will be kicking off the webinar. All right, Carrie, have a wonderful session.
Great, thank you, Ashley, and hi, everyone. So thank you for joining us today for the second of 3 workshops focused on data-driven implementation of tiered interventions with English learners. If you are here the first time, you heard me introduce myself. I'm Carrie Parker. I'm a Principal Research Scientist with the REL. I serve as both facilitator and researcher for the REL's Connecticut English Learner Partnership, which has helped to sponsor this series. So I recognize a number of names as participants as well as districts, and I'm really excited to have you all here. We've been really excited about this 3-part session with more than 100 people who have registered that represent 24 districts across Connecticut, with multiple districts bringing teams of 2 or more people. And in the poll when we began, we saw that there were both ESL instructors as well as content instructors as well as district administrators and some special education. So we're glad to have you both as individuals and as teams. We're very excited about part 2 of the session of the workshop. We hope that by the end of the 3rd session, you will have met our overarching goal. That is that you will feel confident in your ability to use data to improve instruction for English learners using the RTI or the SRBI process. And today's goals, as I said, the workshop is divided into 3 parts. And if you weren't able to attend the first one, that's totally fine. It actually is available now on the IES YouTube channel, and this one will be available as well shortly after we finish and after it gets all cleaned up. So we're going to put the link to the first webinar in the chat today so that you can find it. But if you weren't able to attend it, that's totally fine. You'll fit in fine with today's session. Each of the sessions addresses a different aspect of response to intervention for English learners. And today's session is going to focus on using data to identify the sources of students' difficulties and the processes that can be used for screening and monitoring progress and ways in which these processes can be modified for English learners. So as you can see, the agenda is there. We will have an opportunity to both have interaction with your team, for those of you who are attending in teams, as well as some polls so that we can get a sense of who is on the webinar and what some of your thinkings are about some of the different issues that we're discussing today. As I mentioned, this series is part of the work of the REL's Connecticut English Learner Partnership. And the partnership includes both state and district members. A number of partnership members are participating today, and those of you who are on, we really want to thank you for the work that you have done with us to design both research and technical assistance that's relevant to Connecticut educators who are working with English learners. We're privileged, as Ashley mentioned, to have 2 English learner experts from the Center for Applied Linguistics, CAL, leading our series. Dr. Sarah Moore is Program Director of Pre-K to 12 English Learner Education at Cal, where she oversees projects addressing the educational needs of emergent bilingual students. Sarah holds a PhD in Educational Leadership and Policy Studies with an emphasis on language policy and planning, and a Master's in English as a Second Language Curriculum and Instruction. Lindsey Massoud is a Senior Research Associate at Cal with expertise in educational linguistics, sociolinguistics, and methodologies for meeting the needs of English learners in K-12 settings. Lindsey holds a Master's in Anthropology from the George Washington University with an emphasis on linguistic and sociocultural anthropology and a BA in linguistics from the University of Maryland, College Park. We're really excited to hear from them again as we move into session 2, and I will now turn it over to them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carrie, and welcome everybody. It's great to be here with you again. So we are going to jump right in. We will first look a little bit at how do we identify the source of English learners' difficulties in the classroom. And so we'll first, before we get started, briefly review the 2 fictional students we introduced in session 1, Isabel and Adnan, And we'll do a little thinking together about what data we might need to determine the source of their difficulties. So you'll find their profiles also on page 1 of your handouts if that's easier for you to look at there. So Isabel, she's a 4th grade student, classified as an English learner, speaks Spanish, born in the States, and does well in math but struggles with some literacy skills. And so what we'd like to discuss is what data sources would we now need to figure out why she's struggling? What are the things that we might be able to look at to determine whether she's dealing with just a language difference or maybe a disability? What can help us get to the next phase? So take a couple of minutes with your team. We'll have a clock up on the screen and discuss with your team, and then you can assign somebody to post in the chat box, or if you're attending on your own, just think about this for a couple of minutes and write some suggestions in the chat, and then we'll talk as a group. Okay, so that's been a couple of minutes, so if you can type in your responses now, and then we'll discuss together. Okay, so while others are writing their responses, we're getting a few responses in. So South Windsor is saying that the lost links is not being used by the state, so that's something where we can find out a little bit more about the students, about Isabel, specifically English language proficiency and what that might mean for some of her struggles with literacy. Also, some of these other assessments that are available, like the STAR, which is used in Connecticut for grades K to 3, as I understand it typically, and an early literacy and reading assessment. So might find some more information there, as well as classroom formative assessments. New Haven is suggesting native language literacy skills in comparison to like peers or true peers, which is great. Great suggestion, seeing if the difficulty is in both languages or just in English. Stratford is suggesting error analysis of the benchmarks and other assessment. That's a great suggestion. Kathy Bosco is suggesting the NWEA, providing information on vocabulary, which is great because, of course, you need to know the words to understand literacy. So that's great, looking at some related skills. Stratford, again, reinforcing the native language literacy abilities, which is a really great thought. So any of the assessments of Spanish language, luckily for Isabel, there actually are some assessments available in her native language. So you can look at some of those or work that she's done in Spanish. Hartford is talking about quick phonics screeners in both English and Spanish, oral language background and history. That's great. Yeah, we definitely want to take advantage of understanding students' native language skills and some of their personal background, so that's great. Oh, and we have a discussion going. Perfect. South Windsor is asking Stratford what tests specifically do they use. So Stratford, if you have thoughts, you could post those as well. East Hartford is saying to dig deeper in current data sources. So accommodations, are they working, foundational skills, phonics or decoding, as well as DIBELS. So that's really great because you can look at, with a lot of these tools, you can look at different parts of the assessment and try to differentiate different skills and abilities. So it's a great suggestion. Tamara Swift, parent input, perfect. Yeah, we definitely want to invite parents to be partners in this process and provide information on the students' abilities in the home language. That's great. And Dana Menzies is saying core phonics in English and Spanish. Great. Yes, we can look at some of those other related skills to literacy and see how that might be impacting. Okay, so many good suggestions. All right, Stratford has responded to the question. In the case of Spanish, they use STAR, CEL, DRA2, and RAS Kids. So those are some suggestions from Stratford. Great. And Hartford, they say they're discussing about whether NWA and DIBELS are normed for ELs. So DIBELS has been tested with English learners. I think that we'll get into this a little bit later. It has been tested with English learners and has shown to be able to be used with English learners, but with a big asterisk, because there's also been a study that shows that performance on DIBELS is related to English language proficiency, particularly in the beginning of the year. And so you do want to really put a big asterisk next to that and not just use it without other information about that. So, okay, we have so many good ideas going. We are getting behind, so this is fantastic. I love seeing all these great thoughts. Okay, so let's talk briefly about Adnan. So he is, as we learned in session 1, a second grade student, also an English learner, but he scored not proficient, so he knows less English than Isabel does. He speaks Arabic at home. He recently arrived from Syria as a refugee, and his English reading and writing is below grade level. So are there any additional data sources that you think would be useful in determining Adnan's what he's dealing with? Is he just dealing with being a newcomer, or is he dealing with something else, perhaps? Are there other things that you think might be important for Adnan that maybe wouldn't be used as much for Isabel? Okay, so Kathy says parent interview /student. Yes, absolutely. So we should try to find out a little bit more about his background. He's young and coming as a refugee, so Kathy's wondering, has he had education in his country, or does he have limited or interrupted formal education? So that would be very important to know. We might be able to find out if he knows how to read and write in Arabic or not. Okay. Give just a few more seconds and then we'll try to move on. Okay, and Suzanne, is he showing progress with current interventions? Yes, great. So we might look at some of the progress monitoring tools that are in use and looking at whether he's improving. So perfect. Okay. All right, so I think we'll move on. We got a lot of really great ideas. I love this discussion. Lots of fantastic ideas shared among the participants already, so that's exciting. Okay. All right, so just quickly we'll mention we've given you some space on page 1 of your handout. If you'd like to think of a student with whom you've worked or are currently working, you can put some information about them within your handout and sort of dedicate your learning to them and keep them in mind as we talk through some of the recommendations today. So we showed this slide in session 1, so I won't go through it in great detail, but we wanted to revisit some of the kinds of data sources that we've discussed. There are standardized assessments, formative assessments, screening, and progress monitoring tools. We've talked about all of these already in our discussion so far, as well as school records, personal interactions, which can include interactions with the family, as that has come up too. And basically, we want to really look at a variety of types of data to try to get a full picture of what's going on with the student. So we're going to talk now about language versus disability. So we're going to use a tool from the Office of English Language Acquisition of the U.S. Department of Education. And within this tool, we'll talk about some different student behaviors that you might see in the classroom and how to distinguish whether those might be due to a language difference or to a possible learning disability. So as we go through these, I'll first give you a behavior, and then I'd love for you to just tell me what it could even be your gut reaction. Would you tend to think this was due for an English learner to a language difference, or might you be inclined to look for a possible learning disability if you saw a student displaying this behavior? So if you think it's due to language, you can use the hand-raising tool to raise your hand. If you think it's due to disability, do nothing. Okay. So this is the tool that we'll be using. It's from Chapter 6 of the OELA English Learner Toolkit, which is a chapter about English learners with disabilities. And this is tool number 2 within that chapter, considering the influence of language differences and disabilities on learning behaviors. Okay, so first, within oral comprehension and listening, if an English learner is not responding to verbal directions, just raise your hand if you think that might be due to a language difference, or if you might be inclined to think that that could be a learning disability. Okay. We have a bunch of people raising their hands. Okay, so we have a bunch of hands raised and a bunch of hands not raised, so maybe split on this one. So possible indicator of a language difference, if you know how much vocabulary they know, maybe you use some of the data sources that we mentioned before, and you know that they don't have a lot of English vocabulary, but that they would understand or respond to things in their home language, then you might think, yeah, that's a language difference. Possible indicators of a learning disability could be if they seem confused when given verbal directions in either the home language or English, which again you may know from school. You might have to find that out from parents or others. Then it could be due to a learning disability. So possible data sources that we could use, as I mentioned, their English language proficiency score, the lost links or others, and conversations with parents. So if we wanted to find out if Isabella Rodnon was not responding to verbal directions, maybe we could look into those data sources and try to figure it out. Okay, so the second one we want to look at is within speaking and oral fluency, if a student is unable to orally retell a story. Quick hand raising, would you be inclined to think an English learner wouldn't be able to orally retell a story due to a language difference or to a disability? Not seeing any hands raised so far. Oh, there's one. And it's hard to tell, of course, as we've seen. Okay, A couple of hands raised. A couple of people think it's language. Maybe others haven't answered. Others think it's due to disability. All right, so let's look. One way, Tamara said could be either, depending on level of English. Great, yes. So possible indicator of a language difference is if the student doesn't comprehend a story due to lack of understanding and background knowledge in English. So maybe think about some of the background knowledge and background language that a student would need for that particular story. Possible indicators of a learning disability if they have difficulty retelling the story in their home language as well. Again, it's so important to understand to the extent that we're able what their abilities are in their home language. So if Isabella Rodnan displayed this behavior, maybe we would want information from formative assessments that test reading comprehension and story retelling separately, so that maybe we could try to discriminate between those different skills, or assessment that tests story retelling skills in both languages. We might also be able to use screening tools that test memory or sequencing skills. Okay, so within phonemic awareness and reading, if a student is unable to decode words correctly, might you be more inclined to think for an English learner, yeah, probably due to English language proficiency, or would you think, yeah, maybe we're looking at a disability? Of course, as we found, we don't know for sure, but what would you think more likely? All right, so you've got one for language, couple for language, 3. All right, so we've definitely got some that think language, some that think disability. And Kemin Hawley is asking, is this in their language or English? This is in English. So indicators of a possible language difference is if a sound doesn't exist in their home language, it might be difficult for them to pronounce it. Indicators of possible learning disability if they consistently confuse letters and words that look alike or make letter reversals or substitutions that are not related to their home language. So possible data sources that we could use to figure it out. Student background information, perhaps talking to an ESL specialist, and we know there are a number of them in this room right now, this virtual room, regarding whether the sounds the student is struggling with are present in their home language. So trying to find out a little bit more about their home language, possibly from an ESL specialist. And Kathy Bosco is also making that point. This depends on their language and the similarities in home language. So we have a number of people who are great resources for our group who may have some experience trying to figure this out as well. Screeners in both English and the home language, and other kinds of formative assessments that could be used as well. Okay. Under the umbrella of reading comprehension and vocabulary, perhaps we see a student who doesn't understand a passage read, although they may be able to read with fluency and accuracy. So do you think, Gut, that this would be language or disability? All right, we've got a few voting for probably language and some voting for probably disability. We've been pretty split throughout. All right, so we might think it's a language difference if then we also see that the student doesn't have the background knowledge for the topic. So maybe they just don't know about the topic, and so they don't understand it because there's some vocabulary or other kinds of background knowledge that they'd need in order to understand this passage. Maybe we also see they're unable to use contextual clues to assist with meaning because those are also unfamiliar to them. And that if you see improvement over time as English proficiency increases, then it's pretty good evidence that it's due to a language difference. Possible indicator of a learning disability is if they don't remember or comprehend what was read in either language, their home language or English, if you don't see improvement over time. So possible data sources we could use, again, formative assessments. For this, we could use formative assessments of reading comprehension in both languages if possible. so that you could see the difference between the two languages, as well as a pre-reading assessment of background knowledge. So if you could figure out if the student does have the background knowledge needed, that could help you out a lot. And you'd want to do that with scaffolds such as images, possibly translations into their home language to find out if they do know the information that you're talking about and have the background knowledge for that. You can also talk with parents about their reading abilities in the home, again, including parents as partners in this very important process. Okay, so under the umbrella of writing, maybe you see a student who has difficulty generating a paragraph or writing essays, but can express their ideas orally. So for an English learner, would you maybe be more inclined to think this was due to a language difference? If so, raise your hand again, or maybe due to a learning disability. We saw one hand go right up from South Windsor. We say Sydney is also saying language. All right. Wallingford as well. Okay, so we see a few hands for language and a few others who don't have their hands raised for possibly a disability. So an indicator of a language difference is if the student is not yet proficient in writing English, even though they've developed verbal skills. They make progress over time. Error patterns are similar to other English learners. So if they seem to have a similar pattern of language learning to a lot of other English learners, maybe they've developed oral language first and then are developing more of the literacy. Indicators of a possible learning disability is that maybe they seem to have difficulty paying attention or remembering previously learned information. Maybe there's a motor difficulty related to writing. So how can we figure this out? Well, you can definitely look at their English language proficiency score and look at oral versus writing tasks and how they perform on different subtasks within assessments. You can also do formative written assessments, compare those over time, see if there is improvement, as well as get background information regarding experience writing in the home language. So what do we know, again, about writing in the home language? Okay. So with spelling, if a student spells words incorrectly or sequences letters incorrectly, would you be inclined to think language difference or learning disability? So far, no hands raised. Maybe people are saying learning disability for this one. We've got one hand raised for language. Okay. So a possible indicator of a language difference would be writing that is reflective of English fluency or cultural thought patterns. Or words may align to letter sounds of home language. So if you know about the writing conventions in their home language, maybe the way that they're spelling follow more of those conventions rather than English, and that's something that they're transferring from their first language. Indicators of a possible learning disability is if there are letter sequencing errors or reversals inconsistent with spelling in the home language. So in this case, you might want to look at their English language proficiency score once again to see where they are in terms of literacy, especially if they have scored low or high. That might tell you something about where they are in acquiring English literacy. Writing samples, for example, from formative assessments, and you could use those to talk with an ESL specialist that has knowledge of the home language writing conventions, as well as gather information from family members about the way that letters are sequenced as the home language and the student's experience with writing in the home language. Okay, so within mathematics, maybe you see a student who has some difficulty learning math facts or math operations. Would you be more inclined to think that an English learner displaying that behavior is just learning English, or if that might be a learning disability? Okay, so far, we have no hands raised, so maybe folks are thinking it's more likely a learning disability. So possible indicators of a language difference would be if a student doesn't understand the instructions that are given to them in English, it may not be that they are having difficulty with the facts themselves, but they're not really sure what they're supposed to be doing. And maybe they show improvement if a teacher gives some visual support or other kinds of scaffolds for the instructions in the home language, uses other kinds of scaffolding techniques to make instructions more accessible to a student. Indicators of a possible learning disability if they have difficulty memorizing math facts from one day to the next, or they require manipulatives or other devices to complete math problems, then you might have a learning disability. So possible data sources we could use: standardized math assessment scores, including comparison with true peers. So you might want to look at how other peers who speak the same language, who have similar English language proficiency, also perform on some of these same kinds of tasks. Again, you can use their English language proficiency score and formative assessments that test math and English skills, possibly in concert or separated out together. So one with handwriting, if you see a student unable to copy words correctly, are you more likely to think that is due to language or a disability? All right, we don't have any hands raised, so possibly if people are thinking that's more likely to be due to a learning disability. Glorianne says it depends on the alphabet. Great, yes. So once again, we get to this issue of script. So we know with our friend Adnan that his home language is written with a different script than English. So he is not only learning a new language orally, but also new writing conventions as well. Okay. So indicators of a possible language difference, just like Glorianne said, do they have experience with the writing the English alphabet, or is the alphabet itself something that they are still acquiring? Indicators of a possible learning disability, perhaps they have difficulty copying visual material of other sorts like shapes or letters. Possible data sources we can use is background information regarding their experience with writing English, as well as their experience writing with their home language, and performance on formative assessments over time. So how do they improve as they learn more English? Okay, so this is our last one, our last language versus disability poll. Behavior. If the student appears unmotivated, maybe angry, internalizing or externalizing behaviors in the classroom, if you saw an English learner demonstrating some of these behaviors, would you be more inclined to think that maybe a language difference is involved or a learning disability? I don't see any hands so far, so maybe we're thinking more of a learning disability. So one way that this could actually be due to a language difference is if the student is struggling in the classroom to understand what's going on. Maybe they feel frustrated, they feel like they're not smart in this current context. Maybe in a prior context in their home language they felt like a really smart kid, and here they don't. They might struggle with that. As well as if you have refugee students like Adnan, they might be dealing with a lot in their life. They may have been through quite a lot that could cause some disruption, and they may just need help to reacclimate to a new culture and that kind of thing. But possible indicators of a learning disability, maybe they don't understand instruction across contexts, or they may be frustrated in the class because they have a potential disability. So some of the things that we could look at, of course, English language proficiency. Do they really not understand enough that maybe it's causing them frustration? Or we can have conversations with the school counselor and or the family to learn more about their personal background, past trauma, and their behavior in other contexts. So are they acting like this at school or also at home? So getting some other perspectives on the student from others could be really useful in this case as well. Okay, So I am now going to turn it over to Sarah to talk about screening and progress monitoring.
Thanks so much, Lindsay. It's great to be here. Thanks for joining us again, everyone. I'm going to jump right in talking about screening and progress monitoring for English learners. We're going to continue to push forward in this discussion, and in particular, how to identify what students are struggling with and their particular needs. So during this section of today's presentation, we're going to review recommendations from a publication from the National Center on Response to Intervention, which is RTI for English Language Learners, appropriately using screening and progress monitoring tools to improve instructional outcomes. So this publication focuses on Hispanic English learners, but its recommendations are intended for use with English learners from all language backgrounds. So before we get started in thinking about whether English learners are struggling with English or they may be experiencing a learning disability, we wanted to read this quote from the report. For English learners, performance that indicates at-risk status and the need for more intensive instruction may well be due to ineffective instruction. So that means when delivery only in English without adjusting for a student's current English proficiency level, with results that could mimic an intrinsic learning problem. And English learners' linguistic and educational experiences should be carefully considered in designing appropriate instruction and interventions, and it should not be assumed that slower growth must be due to a learning disability. So basically, when we think about RTI for ELs, we want to be reflective about what instruction and interventions look like and whether these supports are appropriate for our students, and to be really careful and thoughtful about making judgments regarding the sources of students' difficulties. So we talked about best practices for Tier 1 in the last session, and this quote really emphasizes for us why high-quality Tier 1 instruction for English learners is really critical. Before we dig into the report's recommendations, let's just chat briefly about ways you use screening and progress monitoring tools with English learners. So the chat's going to open up for you. And we ask that you discuss with your colleagues for about 2 minutes the following questions. Do you use screening and progress monitoring tools differently with English learners or the same for all students, regardless of language background? And if differently, what is one way you use screening and progress monitoring tools differently? So we'll give you a couple minutes to chat, and then we will discuss as a large virtual group. Okay, so we have a couple thoughts coming in. The South Windsor group says we use the same so that we can frame the data across the board to make comparisons. But we don't expect the English learners to perform above their proficiency levels. Then a different Windsor says all progress monitoring tools are the same. And then Hartford Public Schools says we use screening tools that are not normed for English learners differently for monitoring progress because the projected growth for non-English learners might be different. Right, and I think that's precisely why we're here today. And so hopefully some of the recommendations from the guide and our discussion today and last session, next session, and our in-between sort of group work will help contribute to our capacity for ensuring we're appropriately identifying the sources of students' needs, whether they're from language or other challenges. Okay. So I think we'll move on. So before we get started, we want to talk a little bit about how important it is to identify tools that are appropriate for English learners. So there is some research evidence that screening and progress monitoring tools can be effective with English learners and that results can be accurate and used in making instructional decisions appropriately. However, it's really critical that we not simply use these tools in isolation and without careful consideration for students' backgrounds, English language abilities, and the ways their abilities may impact test performance. So students are going to perform differently due to differences in English proficiency, and it's important that we really recognize when that might be the case and to use multiple sources of data so that we're creating complex and complete pictures of students' skills and abilities, as well as where they may need more help. So the first recommendation regarding using screening tools for English learners from the publication is to use tools with demonstrated reliability and validity to identify and monitor students' need for instructional support in reading in both the home language and in English. So tools that have been shown to be reliable and valid should always be used over other tools. But we need to also be careful to attend to whether they have been studied with English learners specifically, which I know someone had brought up, whether particular assessments had been normed with English learners. So we should also think about the ways in which a particular student's background, for example, like their home language, prior school experiences, English language experience, might also be impacting how they're performing on a particular assessment or a specific type of task within an assessment. So the second recommendation for using screening tools with English learners is to assess students' language skills in the home language and English to provide an appropriate context regarding evaluation of current levels of performance. So there are some valid and reliable measures in Spanish. For example, the Indicadores Dinámicos del Éxito en la Lectura, which is IDEL. It's sort of the Spanish version of DIBELS. You can also use parents as additional sources of information regarding students' abilities in the home language. So you might want to ask questions regarding their school or home experiences with using oral language as well as reading and writing. So in conversations with parents, we want to ask questions that elicit observable behavior. So instead of asking, is your child a good reader of Arabic, you might want to ask, how often does your child read books in Arabic? Does he ever read aloud to you? How do you know he understands what he's reading? Things like that. So these are observable behaviors. So the third recommendation for using screening tools with English learners is to evaluate the potential effect of the process of home language and English acquisition on current performance. So we already know that a student's English language proficiency doesn't impact their performance on English medium assessments such as the DIBELS. These assessments use English to assess skills, and so we have to take care to acknowledge the ways in which they're evaluating skills within a very, very specific English medium context. So what we can do to mitigate risks of inappropriate interpretation of assessments is examine and analyze how English language skills, as well as cultural background knowledge, might be required in order for students to respond accurately to assessment items. So the fourth recommendation regarding using screening tools with English learners is to plan instruction based on what is known about the student's current level of performance and his or her literacy experiences in the home language and in English. So we know that using a variety of data can help us create a more comprehensive and more accurate picture of what's going on with our particular students. So we think about involving parents as partners in order to sort of round out our understanding of students across languages as well as contexts. And we really want to include parents and educators with different areas of expertise in collaborative, team-based approaches that really promote appropriate identification and instructional steps. So at this point, before we move on to the next section, which talks about progress monitoring tools with English learners, we wanted to take a couple questions, a couple minutes to respond to any questions that folks may have.
Great, and this is Carrie. I'll read out the questions, and we have one right now from Glorianne. One concern I have is regarding students that have been in our school for some time and are not reading or writing in their L1. How valid would a test in their first language actually be?
Wow, that's a great question, and I think it speaks to the challenge in distinguishing across bilingual and multilingual learners between languages. I think so from a linguistics perspective, we don't necessarily want to discretely separate the two languages. It is, we know, exceptionally helpful if students have proficiency, oral proficiency in the native language, which then will lead to literacy in the native language, and then also support development of English language literacy. So I think it's a real challenge, and one thing that educators can do to help to sort of combat some of these questions is really try to get a more holistic and comprehensive sense of the kids' backgrounds. And it sounds like that may involve speaking with other experts, including their parents, as sort of partners and collaborators around how best to support the needs of children who are experiencing the challenges you're noting there.
Great, and there's a couple of people are talking about the number of students they have who speak languages other than Spanish. So I guess another question could be, are there any validated tools in languages besides English or Spanish?
Right. So unfortunately, the resources are really limited. We shared one publication that we were able to locate that addressed languages in addition to Spanish other than English between last session and this session. But I think this is where what we need to do is be creative and identify sort of maybe self-created means of identifying whether progress is being made among students, and conducting screening that we know is going to be, to the extent at all possible, reliable and valid. And so that may be sort of looking at benchmarks within particular assessments, existing assessments. But this is a question that has continued to come up in these sessions and as we were preparing and from you all. So I think that maybe what we need to do is Lindsey and I can continue to do a little bit more research and see if we can more thoroughly address it between this session and next.
Great. I think that's probably a really good segue into for you to continue and for us to take some questions later. But I'll just note that there has been a request that we would love to hear your recommendations for universal screening tools and other specific tools. And so I know that you're moving towards that, Sarah, so I'll let you just go ahead and we'll take questions again in a little bit.
Yes, that is a fantastic segue. And Lindsey will talk a little bit more specifically about tools after we finish talking through these recommendations. So the first recommendation for using progress monitoring tools with English learners is to monitor student progress in all languages of instruction. So again, including valid and reliable measures in a student's home language. This is what we're talking about, if it's available, of course. It is true that the vast majority of English learners in this country are native Spanish speakers or come from homes where Spanish is the language spoken in the home. But we also want to acknowledge and recognize that there are students come from a wide range of linguistic backgrounds. We want to use formative assessments for additional data, and again, engaging parents as resources, and really seeing parents not only as resources in sort of these activities, but partners. So the second recommendation for using progress monitoring is to set rigorous goals that support students toward meeting grade level standards. So we serve our students well when we really believe that they're able and that they can, with appropriate instructional supports and strategies, meet standards and make strides within the classroom. So this includes attention to English language proficiency, and what we want to do is set goals that include students' English language development, both in the goals themselves as well as in the way that instruction is structured in order to meet those goals. So the third recommendation for using progress monitoring tools with English learners is to evaluate growth frequently, increasing intensity of instruction when growth is less than expected. So this kind of ongoing regular feedback through formative assessment as well as potentially other data sources can really help us to identify whether an intervention is working for a student and then to adjust that instruction as appropriate to ensure that students are equipped to be meeting the goals that we've set for them. So the fourth recommendation for using progress monitoring tools with English learners is to evaluate growth as compared to that of true peers. And this has come up a couple of times. We talked about it during the last session, and one of our participants mentioned it when we were getting started earlier when Lindsay was talking. So if you have a population of students with similar language backgrounds, they'd be at the same grade level, same English language proficiency levels, then this is an opportunity to try to disaggregate data from subgroups of these students and then identify whether is a student's performance on a particular assessment due to a language difference or another source of difficulty. So in other words, if all fourth grade Spanish-speaking English learners perform similarly to each other on assessment when compared with other subgroups of students, then the language difference may be at play there. But if you have one student who performs much lower than those true peers, we would call them, then there may be something else at play for that student. And so again, looking at a real wide range of data for determining why that student scored lower than true peers is a way of sort of getting a sense of what's really going on there. So we're going to move on to a poll. We're going to think about sort of as again, our virtual group, whether these recommended practices you see and are in place in your school and district. So we have one poll question for each of the 8 recommendations, which is sort of the same structure that we used last session. So the first recommendation was tools, that we use tools with demonstrated reliability and validity to identify and monitor students' need for instructional supports in reading in both the native and language and English, that we assess students' language skills in first and second language to provide an appropriate context regarding evaluation of current levels of performance, that we evaluate the potential effects of the process of L1 and L2 acquisition on current performance. We plan instruction based on what is known about the student's current level. And then we monitor students' progress in all languages of instruction, keeping in mind, as we've talked about, how sort of challenging that can be and the limited resources available. That we set rigorous goals that support students toward meeting grade level standards. that we evaluate growth frequently, and that in doing so, we increase intensity of instruction when the growth seems to be less than expected. And then that we evaluate growth as compared to that of true peers. So we'll give you a couple of minutes to think through and talk through your responses to those polls. And once it looks like a reasonable number of our participants have responded, we'll do a little debrief. So we'll give you about 2 or 3 minutes to chat and answer the polls. So I'm going to start sort of talking through these so we can continue our discussion. It looks like in terms of tools with demonstrated reliability and validity, there's all kinds of responses here. Most say sometimes, but then a number of you also say rarely, and several say no. We know that can be a challenge. Assess students, native students' language skills in L1 and L2. Looks like very few say always. A number say never. Most say rarely. Okay, so it's happening sometimes, but not all the time. We evaluate the potential effect of the process of L1 and L2 on current performance. Looks like there's a lot of diversity in terms of how this particular recommendation is or is not followed. We plan instruction based on what is known about the student's current level of performance and his L1 and L2 literacy experiences. It looks like for this one, 30% say always, and there's another 30 say sometimes. So this one looks like more likely folks are following. We monitor student progress in all languages. Again, I think this really comes back to the challenge associated with having limited resources in numerous languages beyond Spanish. We set rigorous goals that support students toward meeting grade level standards. Looks like many of you say always, and so I think that sort of speaks to the commitment of the folks in the room, if you will. So even though the sort of structural and systemic supports that we need as educators may not be in place, that we're really committed to promoting high quality instruction for all kids, and especially those whom we're discussing today. We evaluate growth frequently, increasing intensity and instruction when growth is not expected. Okay, looks like always and sometimes are all of the responses. So I think, again, this speaks to our in the room commitment to ensuring success for our students. And we evaluate growth compared to true peers. Sometimes, looks like many of you say rarely or never. And I think this is another example of creatively utilizing resources and data that may be available to us that might not look like formal data and might not be from a standardized assessment, but you're really drawing on your expertise as an educator and someone who knows the student or is getting to know your students. Great. Okay, so we're going to chat for a couple minutes now. About some concrete ideas for how you might be able to implement what we've discussed in your school or district. So if you turn to page 4 in your handouts, you'll see a table that's called Screening and Progress Monitoring Recommendations for English Learners. So you might want to take a couple of minutes and think about what examples that you have seen or that you think would really work that correspond to the various 8 recommendations. We'll give you a couple minutes, maybe 2 or 3 minutes to discuss amongst yourselves, and then post thoughts in the chat box. What is one concrete way you can implement one or more of these recommendations regarding screening and progress monitoring for ELs? So that's our sort of guiding question. One concrete way you can implement one or more of the recommendations. So if you've had enough time to chat amongst yourselves, you may want to assign someone to be the recorder and type up your thoughts in the chat box. We'll see what folks are thinking. Okay, so South Windsor Group 1 says, we're thinking we can continue to improve by planning instruction on what is known about the student's linguistic abilities. So they're recommending using resources such as Learner's English to look at linguistic challenges in students' native languages and then explicitly teach areas of concern in the second language. That's a fantastic idea. And I think that really digging into what's going on linguistically can go a long way toward our sort of sense of distinguishing between is are challenges associated with language or are they associated with other issues that may involve recommendations for special education. And so we would always encourage, to the extent possible, folks to delve a little bit more deeply into understanding what is going on in children's first languages. One example may have to do with, for example, sign systems. So students may know how to read in their first language, but read or write in their first language, but that language may not utilize the alphabet. And so that's an example, I think, of how you might operationalize what South Windsor is recommending. And then East Hartford says create groups of true peers across the district and track their results on assessments. That's a fantastic idea. Oh, that's a fantastic idea. So we've talked about true peers in a classroom setting, and Lindsay and I have thought and sort of been around folks doing it even at the school level, but that's a wonderful idea where if there are not as many true peers in a particular class or school, that maybe we want to open it up and look across the district. That's a great idea. Fantastic. So I think we will move on to focusing a little bit more, well, a lot more, on Connecticut in particular.
Great. Yeah, we're just going to talk a little bit about the Connecticut-specific context in relationship to the ideas that we've been talking about, just to sort of highlight Connecticut's approach and the ways in which what we've been talking about integrate well with how Connecticut approaches SRBI. And so overall, the state's approach is one that includes a number of different kinds of assessments, universal common, as we've talked about, diagnostic, and in some rarer cases, comprehensive evaluations for students. And that one that really emphasizes data teams. So we've been talking a lot about, throughout both of these sessions so far, and we'll get into it even more in session 3, the importance of different areas of expertise, which is why we've encourage you to attend as teams with different areas of expertise, because in this process it's really difficult, and we've talked about a lot of really tricky things like the absence of true peers, the absence of the right kinds of assessments we need, especially for languages other than Spanish. And so having data teams is part of Connecticut's overall approach and something we think is especially critical for English learners. Connecticut also really emphasizes data-driven, and so as a REL, we talk a lot about data, but it's also really consistent with Connecticut's approach. And Connecticut recommends explicit rules for how decisions are made throughout the state, and so it's important to remember that the use of data for English learners and decision-making should include multiple data sources, a collaborative approach, and this is what we see Connecticut encouraging from the state level as well. And so just as a brief reminder, here are our types of data, and we're going to do a quick poll about data sources. And so these are some of the types of data that we use. And now we'd like to talk a little bit about the kinds of data that you use. So we're curious. We have one poll here for each data source. You can answer individually or as a team. We'll give you a couple of minutes to discuss together and come up with your answers and post those responses. And just tell us, what kinds of tools do you use when making decisions for English learners about whether they might need Tier 2 or Tier 3 interventions. So we'll just give you a couple of minutes to talk together or to reflect on your own if you're attending on your own, and then we'll talk about the results. And once you've responded to the polls, if you want to share a little bit more about which data sources you find most useful, specifically when making intervention decisions for English learners, you can also respond in the chat on the left. Okay, so it looks like almost all of you use almost everything, with just maybe one or two on each type of data not being used, with the exception of student background information obtained via personal interactions. Yeah, so this is great. So I think we've hopefully demonstrated today why sometimes those personal interactions are really valuable, both with the student as well as with parents and other family members. So I think, yeah, I think especially in light of some of the struggles that we've talked about, the lack of assessments in other languages, even sort of not a lot in Spanish, but at least there's something, but really a dearth in other languages. And so sometimes that first language, home language knowledge can come through some of these personal interactions with families, as well as even with the students. So yeah, so we hope that maybe you might consider including that in some of your decision making in the future. Okay, so which data sources do you find most useful? So South Windsor says the Lost Links results, parent interview survey of L1 development. That's great. So you guys, I am interpreting that as you actually have a formal interview or survey that you do, which is great. Maybe you could share that with others if others are interested. And district screening results on a number of different types of measures. Torrington also says the lost links and personal interaction. They say mainstream teacher input, the DRA in English and Spanish, and parent information. Great. Yeah, so you're using a lot of different kinds of data sources, which is great. Glorianne says maybe not the most useful, but definitely always eye-opening is personal conversations with the students. She works at the secondary level. She says they talk about what they're having trouble with. That's great. Thank you for sharing that, Glorianne. That can be really important, and again goes to the value of the personal interaction with both the student as well as others who know the student well, those who know their home language as well. Walling says, I work with K2, so personal interactions with student is not always helpful. Yeah, so there are differences with regards to the maturity levels of the students, how old they are, how self-reflective they can be. So that makes a lot of sense. So there are different limitations in different situations, for sure. South Windsor says the Solemn Student Oral Language Observation Matrix. They find that very useful. Great. Okay, so I think I don't see that anyone is typing, so I think we can move on. In our last few minutes together, we wanted to share a couple of resources that may be helpful to you in identifying specific tools. So we know this is a huge question. So the Connecticut State Department of Education just recently revamped their website and they have a number of good resources there. They have an approved menu of K-3 universal screening reading assessments. It includes information on whether a Spanish version is available. You might well have seen this since you are in Connecticut, of course. And then we wanted to share with you the Center on Response to Intervention's online interactive chart, which provides information on validity and reliability. I'm going to share these links with you now in the chat as well to some overarching pages on the Connecticut State Department of Education website. So you can explore some more there as well. Okay. So here, just really quick, this is a portion of the Connecticut approved screening assessment. So it tells you what it is and briefly what it does and whether there's a Spanish version. So it's a good place to start. But we wanted to really highlight this as well. I'm curious if anyone has used this or seen this. Could you maybe raise your hand? I'd be curious as we talk about this if anyone has used this tool. Oh, great. Glorianne, Hartford. Awesome. Okay, so some of you are already familiar with this, and others of you are not. So basically, this is a great tool that has a database of different types of assessments used for RTI, and it includes a number of different kinds of information. I wanted to highlight some of that information for you briefly. So you see here you have reliability, validity. Basically, the darker the circle, the better in those. And then what you have in this 7th column, disaggregated reliability, validity, and classification data for diverse populations. So this is something where you can pay a lot of attention to this when you're looking for assessments that may have been studied with English learners. So this gets back to that question that came up earlier about assessments that have been normed with English learners or at least studied with English learners. So in some cases they may not have been normed with English learners, but they've been studied with English learners, and there may be some research that shows that they are reliable and valid when used with English learners. And so if you see that straight line there, that means they haven't been studied with diverse populations, but in some cases you'll see then a circle that's either partially or fully filled in that indicates that they have been studied with diverse learners. And then when you click on a specific item, then you can find out more information, and basically then you can scroll down and find out more information about which populations it's been studied with. Has it been studied specifically with English learners? Because the disaggregation doesn't always necessarily mean English learners. And so you can scroll down within a page and find out more information about that, and it has links to things. It has a lot of technical information, but I think if you can see here with the Dibbles Next that it's a partially filled in circle. So it has been studied with English learners, but like we had mentioned briefly before, there's some information and research that indicates that it can be used with English learners, but there's sort of an asterisk next to that you need to take it with a grain of salt, include other kinds of data. Don't just use it sort of in a straightforward way that like you would with maybe other kids. So that's a tool that we think could be really useful in figuring out whether a certain assessment might be useful for you to use with your English learners. So we wanted to come back to Isabel and Adnan and talk about maybe just some possible cases for how this might go with them. And so with Adnan, for example, so we could say he scored well below the benchmark on the Dibbles. So he did not score well. He scored well below the benchmark. He's definitely struggling. And this was consistent at the beginning of the year with performance of some of his true peers who were also newcomers still developing their English language proficiency. He improved by the middle of the year in most subtests, but did not improve in reading comprehension. And he was improving at a slower rate than some of his true peers. So maybe the teacher had some conversations with his parents with help from a translator, and they reported that they also had difficulty engaging him in reading in Arabic. And so in this case, this might be an instance where we look over time and we confer with the parents and we think maybe we need to examine instruction, just make sure that appropriate supports are being provided so that his struggles are being supported by really good Tier 1 instruction in the classroom. But given his scores in comparison to true peers, the information obtained from his parents, maybe it makes sense to move him into a reading intervention, monitor progress closely and frequently, watch his development, consider referral for more intensive intervention if sufficient progress is not made. So just as sort of to put a possible context to some of the things that we've been talking about. And then for Isabel, she also scored below the benchmark, but not far below. But she scored above the benchmark on the IDEL, the Spanish assessment that we mentioned earlier. Her scoring below the benchmark on DIBELS was consistent with other Spanish-speaking students in her class, and she was just below. In this case, possibly a native English speaker may have been referred for Tier 2 intervention, but the team at her school decided they wanted to know more. So to get a sense of her literacy abilities, then they gave her the IDEL. She scored above the benchmark. And in this case, maybe the teachers looked at the curriculum to ensure appropriate supports are being made some instructional changes to address Spanish literacy and the use of the skills that she had in her native language. And by the middle of the year, she almost met the benchmark. By the end, she had met it. And it became clear that maybe there was a need to tailor instruction rather than to refer her for additional services or interventions. So just to kind of put a little bit of a specific case on it and give some examples of ways that we might see this data playing out and the collaborative approach playing out for our two kids, Isabel and Adnan. So we wanted to make some time for questions. If there are remaining questions or thoughts, we'd love to hear any thoughts that you have on any of this or resources that have been helpful for you as we close out.
Yes, so this is Carrie again, so please do type your questions into the chat. I have two questions, Lindsay, that came up earlier that I was hoping that you could engage with. The first is actually about true peers. So we struggle with true peers, particularly if there aren't any students who speak the language. So
yeah, right. So yeah, we love the idea that someone brought up about trying to broaden your pool, which is tricky because instruction might look different across those contexts. So there would be some differences between those peers. But I think essentially what we have is a really tricky process that we're engaging in when we're doing RTI with English learners because they're doing double duty in school and they're learning everything that all the kids are supposed to be learning, but they're also learning language. And in almost anything with English learners, you're going to deal with what's available to you. And so this is why we want to look at multiple data sources. So if you don't have true peers, you might be able to find information about other kids that may be true peers at other schools. But then you use whatever is available to you. So if you don't have that, you don't have it. And the same with the first language assessments. If you don't have it, you don't have it. And it's the challenge of working with really diverse students. And so I think what you want to do is think together as a team about what you might have access to. Are there resources from the family, from other kinds of assessments, that kind of thing that you could use to get some information, even if it's not the sort of researched, validated information that you would like to have, like if you're comparing true peers on researched, validated, reliable assessments. And so I think it's just that putting your heads together from your different areas of expertise and trying to determine what data sources you have at your fingertips, maybe thinking creatively about what you could use. The resource that we emailed out at the end of the last session provided just a simple tool that's available in, I think, 6 languages to get a sense of home language literacy. So it's like a page or two. It's a simple tool, but it exists. So if that's what you have, you don't have the True Peers, that's what you have. And I think it's using that collaborative approach, figuring out what data you have, and trying to make the best decision you can. And then that's where progress monitoring comes in, because you also will see if what you're doing is working for the kid. And if it's not, then maybe you change the approach. And so it's better if we can figure out at the beginning and create the right intervention, but we're all sort of doing the best we can. And I know, yeah, I know you all feel that way. So hopefully,
okay, yeah,
that's not a great answer, but it's sort of what we've got.
Right, absolutely. And we don't have time for this last question, but I'm gonna read it out so that you can be thinking about this for the third session. That there seem to be numerous resources for the elementary level, but a limited number for the secondary level. So I know we need to move on to our next slides, but I just want to make sure that we get that raised so that you guys can be thinking about that for next time.
Great.
And I believe Sarah is going to finish up. Is that right?
Yep.
Great.
And I think, again, we'll sort of in between now and next time pursue a couple of these open questions. But the resource that Lindsey was describing could be useful with secondary students because it's getting at literacy. So it's probably better for older students. So that is an example of something that may be useful. But we're going to wrap up for now and talk a little bit about team planning. First, we're going to summarize what we've done today. So we're trying to build participants' capacity to use data to identify the sources of students' difficulties, whether those are language or something different, something other than language, and discuss processes for screening and monitoring progress and ways in which these may need to be modified for English learners. So for team planning homework, take a look at page 5 in your handouts. So we're suggesting that your teams discuss the guiding questions below. What are the implications of today's learning for your practice? And so it may be that you jump back to page 1, where last time and at the beginning of this session, we suggested that you might think about, is there an English learner that you're currently working with or have worked with in the past who might function as sort of a case study example, similar to the discussions we've been having around Isabel and Adnan, thinking about, okay, so what we've learned today, how can we apply this to what we know of our students in our classrooms and in the real world? And then what's one action step you'd like to take tomorrow? One action step for this month and one action step for this year. And again, all of that is sort of those guiding questions are provided for you on page 5 in your handouts for today.
All right, so this is Ashley again. I just want to thank everybody for joining us today. And I want to remind you, we will have a feedback survey on this webinar. And we want to encourage you to complete the survey so we can find out your feedback on the webinar. After this webinar closes, you will see a new window open in your browser where you can complete the survey online. And here's information to contact Sarah and Lindsey. And we want to thank everyone for coming again today. We want to remind you that the final session is on Thursday, March 22nd. That's in 3 weeks, again at 3 p.m. And so we hope you all will be able to participate in that final webinar as well. And again, as I said earlier, today's webinar recording will be archived and uploaded to the IES YouTube channel. We will send you an email when the recording is available online. We also did provide you an email with the recording for the first webinar, which is online. And we, again, hope you will be able to join us for the next webinar. And please do complete the stakeholder feedback survey so that we can always improve our events. Thank you again for joining, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Yes, thanks everyone, and we will see you in 3 weeks.
Thanks so much,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.
We enjoyed it.